Before the story begins, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more emotional and surprising stories ahead. And now let's dive into today's story. The moment I realized my family had celebrated Christmas without me, something inside me went quiet. My name is Evelyn Parker. I was 68 years old that Christmas, and for weeks I had been preparing for what I thought would be a warm family gathering. Every year I hosted Christmas Eve dinner. It wasn't an obligation. It was a tradition. The kind that survives decades, losses, and changes. I polished the silver serving tray that had belonged to my mother. I hung stockings above the fireplace. I spent nearly 6 hours cooking a turkey, baking pecan pie, and preparing all the side dishes my family loved. The house smelled like cinnamon, rosemary, and memories. By 5 o'clock, everything was ready. The dining table was set for 7 people. I even placed little name cards beside each plate, something my granddaughter Emma always found amusing. Outside, snow drifted gently across the neighborhood. Inside, I kept glancing toward the front window every few minutes. First, I wasn't worried. Families run late during the holidays. Traffic happens. Plans shift. I poured myself a cup of coffee and waited. 6 o'clock came and went. Then 7. By 8, the turkey had cooled. The candles had burned halfway down. My phone remained silent. No calls. No texts. No explanations. I sent Jason a simple message asking if everything was okay. No response. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. I cleared a few dishes. Reheated some food. Checked the driveway again. Nothing. The silence inside the house felt larger than the house itself. Around 10 that night, I sat alone at the dining room table. 7 plates. 1 person. I looked at the empty chairs and remembered Christmases from years ago when the room had been filled with laughter. My late husband had always sat at the head of the table, carving the turkey while Emma tried to sneak extra dessert. Those memories felt painfully close and impossibly far away at the same time. Finally, just before midnight, I opened social media. I wasn't looking for answers. I think I was simply trying to distract myself. But the first photo I saw stopped me cold. There was Jason. There was Lauren. There was Emma. And there was the rest of the family standing in front of a massive stone fireplace at a luxury ski resort in Colorado. Everyone was smiling. Everyone was together. The caption read, "Perfect Family Christmas Getaway." I stared at the screen for a long time. Not because I was confused. Because suddenly everything made sense. They hadn't forgotten. They hadn't gotten delayed. They hadn't changed plans at the last minute. They had made plans. Plans that didn't include me. I placed my phone face down on the table. Then I slowly blew out the candles one by one. The room grew darker with each small flame that disappeared. And as I stood there in the silence, I realized something I should have understood years earlier. This Christmas wasn't the beginning of the story. It was the moment I finally saw the story clearly. The next morning, the house felt different. Not louder. Not quieter. Just honest. For the first time in a long time, there were no expectations left to protect. I woke up before sunrise, made myself a cup of coffee, and sat by the kitchen window watching fresh snow settle across the backyard. The Christmas lights I had hung 2 weeks earlier still glowed softly against the darkness. Usually that sight brought me comfort. This time it brought clarity. I kept thinking about the photograph from the ski resort. Not the expensive lodge. Not the decorations. Not even the smiles. What stayed with me was how natural it all looked. Nobody appeared uncomfortable. Nobody looked guilty. They were not pretending to enjoy themselves. They were enjoying themselves. And somehow that realization hurt less than I expected. Because it answered a question I had been asking myself for years. Was I imagining the distance growing between us? The answer was no. The distance had been real all along. Christmas had simply removed the last excuse. As the morning passed, memories began surfacing one after another. Small moments I had dismissed at the time. A birthday dinner moved to another restaurant after I had already arrived at the original location. A school performance where Emma told me afterward that everyone else had known about the schedule change. A family barbecue where I learned from photographs that it had happened at all. Each event had come with a reasonable explanation, a misunderstanding, a forgotten message, a last-minute decision. I had accepted every explanation because I wanted to believe my family cared. Looking back now, the pattern was impossible to ignore. The exclusions had not started yesterday. They had simply become more polished over time. Around noon, my phone finally buzzed. A text from Jason. "Sorry we missed dinner. Things got hectic. We will talk when we get back." That was all. No apology. No explanation. No acknowledgement of what had happened. I stared at the message for several seconds before setting the phone down. Years earlier, I would have responded immediately. I would have searched for the right words. Tried to preserve the peace. This time I did nothing. The silence felt unfamiliar at first, then strangely comforting. Later that afternoon, I walked through the house room by room. Family photographs lined the hallway. Vacation pictures. Graduation pictures. Holiday pictures. In nearly every frame I saw the same thing. Me standing slightly to the side. Smiling. Present. Useful. But somehow separate. I had spent years convincing myself that being included was enough. I never stopped to ask whether I was actually valued. By evening, the leftovers were packed away. The table was cleared. The candles were gone. Christmas was over. Yet instead of feeling defeated, I felt something else beginning to take shape. It was small, quiet, almost impossible to name, but it was there. For the first time in years, I stopped wondering why my family kept pulling away. And I started wondering what my life might look like if I stopped chasing people who were already walking in the opposite direction. Over the next few days, I stopped filling the silence with excuses. That alone changed everything. When people disappoint you repeatedly, you develop a habit of explaining their behavior for them. You tell yourself they are busy, stressed, distracted. You become an attorney for people who never asked to be defended. I had done that for years, especially when it came to Lauren. The strange thing was that she had never been openly cruel. Not in the way people imagine. She smiled. She sent birthday cards. She remembered holidays. If someone met her for 5 minutes, they would probably describe her as thoughtful. That was what made it so difficult to see what was happening. Her influence lived in the spaces between things. In conversations that ended too quickly. In invitations that never arrived. In plans that changed after everyone else had already agreed. I remembered the first time I noticed something felt different. It was nearly 8 years earlier, shortly after Jason and Lauren moved into a larger home across town. Before then, Jason used to call every Sunday afternoon. Sometimes we talked for 10 minutes, sometimes for an hour. Then the calls became shorter, then less frequent, then occasional. Every time I asked if everything was all right, he assured me it was. Work was busy. Life was busy. Everyone was busy. The word busy became a wall nobody could question. One memory surfaced more clearly than the others. Emma had been performing in a school concert. I had bought a new sweater for the occasion and driven nearly 40 minutes to the auditorium. When I arrived, the parking lot was empty. Confused, I checked the schedule online. The performance had been moved to the previous evening. Jason apologized afterward. He said he thought someone had told me. Lauren said the email must have been lost. At the time, I accepted the explanation. Standing in my kitchen now, years later, I realized something important. I was the only person who had missed that concert. Another memory followed. Then another. Family photographs posted online after gatherings I never heard about. Weekend trips mentioned weeks later. Restaurant celebrations discovered by accident. Individually, each event looked harmless. Together, they formed a pattern so obvious that I wondered how I had ignored it for so long. One afternoon, I opened an old photo album from a shelf in the living room. The pages smelled faintly of dust and age. There was Jason at 12 years old holding a fishing rod beside his father. There was our first Christmas in the house. There was Emma as a toddler sitting on my lap. I studied each photograph carefully. What struck me was not what had changed. It was what had disappeared. The sense of belonging. Somewhere along the way, I had gone from being part of the family to being an accessory to it. Useful when needed. Convenient when available. Easy to overlook when something more exciting came along. I closed the album and looked out the window as snow drifted across the yard. For the first time, I stopped asking whether Lauren had influenced the distance between me and Jason. The answer no longer mattered. What mattered was that Jason had allowed it. And once that truth settled into place, another question began quietly forming in my mind. If they had been hiding so much from me for all these years, what else did I not know? That question stayed with me for days. I found myself looking at ordinary things differently. The house, the photographs, the boxes stored in closets that had not been opened in years. On the Friday after Christmas, a winter storm rolled through town. Snow covered the streets, and the wind rattled the old windows in the attic. I had planned to spend the afternoon reading, but instead I found myself climbing the narrow staircase above the garage. The attic had always been my husband's domain. After he passed away 3 years earlier, I rarely went up there. Some doors take time to open. Dust floated through the cold air as I pulled the chain that switched on the overhead light. The room was filled with storage bins, old holiday decorations, and shelves lined with decades of family history. I began sorting through boxes simply to keep my hands busy. Tax records, photo albums, old greeting cards. Nothing unusual. Then I found a cedar chest tucked beneath a workbench. I recognized it immediately. It had belonged to my husband, Robert. Inside were folders, notebooks, and neatly labeled envelopes. Everything was organized exactly the way he always kept things. I sat on the floor and slowly began reading. Most of the documents were familiar. Insurance papers, property records, investment summaries. Then I noticed a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in Robert's handwriting. My heart skipped. I carefully opened it. The letter inside was short, simple, personal. He wrote about family, about trust, about making decisions with wisdom rather than emotion. At the end of the letter, he mentioned a collection of documents stored in another folder nearby. Curious, I searched through the chest until I found it. The folder contained paperwork I had completely forgotten about. Years earlier, when Robert was restructuring several family assets, he had created a trust designed to protect certain properties and investments. At the time, I paid little attention. He handled most of the legal details. What mattered now was one specific clause. I read it twice, then a third time. Certain decisions regarding the trust could only be authorized by me. Not Jason. Not anyone else. Me. The realization settled over me slowly. This was not about money. It was about responsibility. Robert had intentionally placed important authority in my hands. Authority I had never exercised because there had never been a reason to. Until now. Outside, snow tapped softly against the attic window. I continued reading through the documents for nearly 2 hours. The deeper I looked, the more I understood how carefully Robert had planned everything. He had anticipated future complications. He had built safeguards. He had trusted me to protect what mattered if circumstances ever required it. By the time I closed the final folder, daylight was fading. I sat quietly beside the cedar chest and stared across the attic. For the first time since Christmas Eve, I felt something shift. Not anger. Not revenge. Something steadier. Confidence. Because while my family had spent years deciding how much space I deserved in their lives, they had overlooked something important. There were parts of our family's future that depended on decisions only I could make. 3 days after I found the documents in the attic, the family returned from Colorado. I knew because Lauren immediately began posting photographs online. Ski slopes, hot chocolate by the fire, matching sweaters, smiling faces. Looking at the pictures no longer hurt the way they had on Christmas Eve. Once you see something clearly, it loses its power to confuse you. Late that afternoon, my phone rang. Jason. I let it ring twice before answering. His voice sounded unusually cheerful. He asked how I was doing as though nothing unusual had happened. Then he mentioned the trip. He called it spontaneous. He said everything came together quickly. He spoke casually, carefully avoiding the one subject that mattered. Why nobody had told me. Why nobody had invited me. I listened quietly. When he finished, I simply said I was glad they had enjoyed themselves. The silence that followed seemed to surprise him. He was waiting for disappointment. Waiting for questions. Waiting for me to make things easy by pretending everything was normal. Instead, I gave him nothing. The conversation ended a few minutes later. That evening, there was a knock at my front door. Jason and Lauren stood on the porch holding a gift bag decorated with snowflakes. Lauren smiled warmly and handed it to me. Inside was a souvenir coffee mug from the resort. I thanked her and placed it on the kitchen counter. Nobody mentioned the empty chair at Christmas dinner. Nobody mentioned the meal I had prepared. Nobody mentioned the photographs. It felt less like a visit and more like a performance. We sat in the living room for nearly an hour. Lauren talked about the mountains. Jason talked about the weather. I noticed something interesting. Every time the conversation drifted toward family traditions, Lauren quickly redirected it somewhere else. It was subtle, almost elegant. If I had not been paying attention, I might have missed it. But now I saw everything. Before leaving, Jason asked whether I had any plans for New Year's Day. When I told him I had not decided yet, he nodded and said they might stop by if they had time. If they had time. The words lingered long after the door closed behind them. Years ago, those words would have wounded me. Now they sounded strangely revealing. I walked into the dining room and looked at the framed photograph of Robert that sat on the sideboard. The same photograph had been there for years. Yet that evening it seemed different somehow. Perhaps because I finally understood what he had tried to leave behind. Not money. Not property. Responsibility. Judgment. Trust. Over the following days, something unexpected happened. My family became unusually attentive. Jason called twice. Lauren sent messages asking how I was doing. At first glance it looked like concern. But beneath it I sensed curiosity. They were checking the temperature of the room, measuring whether I was upset, determining whether the Christmas situation would simply fade away like every previous disappointment. I answered politely, calmly, briefly, and with each conversation I noticed the same thing. The more peaceful I became, the more uncomfortable they seemed. What they did not know was that while they were busy wondering how I felt, I was beginning to understand exactly what I needed to do next. The first week of January arrived with clear skies and bitter cold. The Christmas decorations were coming down across the neighborhood, but inside my house, something else was changing. For years I had been operating on habit, sending birthday checks, covering unexpected expenses, contributing to family vacations, paying for little extras that nobody asked for directly but always seemed to expect. I never kept score. Family was not supposed to be transactional. Yet once I stopped and looked honestly at the pattern, I realized something uncomfortable. The support had become invisible. Not because it was small, but because it was constant. People rarely notice the floor beneath their feet until it disappears. On a Tuesday morning, I called Daniel Brooks, the attorney who had helped Robert organize several legal matters years earlier. He remembered me immediately. We scheduled a meeting for later that week. When I arrived at his office, he greeted me warmly and spent nearly 2 hours reviewing the trust documents I had found in the attic. He explained every clause carefully, every safeguard, every responsibility. Most importantly, he confirmed what I had already begun to suspect. Several important decisions required my direct approval. Without it, nothing could move forward. As I drove home, I felt calm, not powerful, not angry, simply informed. Knowledge has a way of quieting confusion. Over the following days, I made several small changes. Nothing dramatic. Nothing anyone could reasonably criticize. I stopped offering financial help before it was requested. I stopped solving problems that were not mine to solve. I stopped volunteering resources simply because I knew someone might need them. The changes seemed insignificant to me. To my surprise, they were noticed almost immediately. Jason called one evening and casually mentioned that the family was thinking about taking another trip later in the year. In the past, that conversation often ended with me contributing toward airfare or hotel costs for Emma. This time I wished them well and changed the subject. A long pause followed. A few days later, Lauren asked whether I planned to continue paying for Emma's private music lessons. The question was framed politely, almost as an assumption. I told her I was reviewing my finances and had not made any decisions yet. Another silence. Another surprised reaction. Nobody argued. Nobody complained. Yet I could feel the shift taking place. Expectations were colliding with uncertainty. One afternoon, I opened my mailbox and found a handwritten thank you card from Lauren. The timing felt unusual. In nearly 10 years, she had rarely written personal notes. I placed the card beside the others on the kitchen counter and continued making lunch. That evening I realized something important. The attention I was receiving now looked very different from genuine connection. Genuine connection does not suddenly appear when benefits become uncertain. Genuine connection exists long before that moment arrives. As the days passed, the phone calls increased. The messages became warmer. Invitations began appearing again. On the surface, everything looked positive. But beneath those smiles and friendly conversations, I sensed growing concern. Somewhere in the background, people were beginning to realize that the version of Evelyn Parker they had always relied upon was quietly disappearing, and they still had no idea how much more there was to discover. By the end of January, the pattern had become impossible to miss. The more I stepped back, the more my family stepped forward. Invitations arrived that would never have appeared a month earlier. Phone calls came at unusual times. Messages arrived asking how I was feeling, what I was doing, whether I needed anything. The attention should have made me happy. Instead, it made me curious. One Saturday afternoon, Emma came to visit. Unlike the adults, she had never learned how to hide what she was thinking. At 13 years old, she still spoke with the honesty that only children possess. We spent the afternoon baking chocolate chip cookies in the kitchen. Snow covered the backyard, and soft music played from a small speaker on the counter. For the first hour, we talked about school, friends, and her music lessons. Then, without warning, she mentioned the Colorado trip. "Mom was really worried you might find out before we got there," she said while decorating a cookie with frosting. I paused. "Find out about what?" I asked gently. Emma looked up, suddenly realizing she may have said more than she intended. "The trip," she replied. "She kept saying we should not post pictures until later because Grandma might see them." The room grew very quiet. I continued stirring frosting as though nothing had changed. "Did your dad know?" I asked. Emma nodded. Everybody knew. There were lots of conversations about it before Christmas. She returned to decorating cookies, unaware that she had just answered questions I had been carrying for years. That evening, after Emma left, I sat alone in the living room and replayed the conversation in my mind. There it was. Not suspicion. Not interpretation. Not a feeling. Fact. The exclusion had been planned. Discussed. Managed. The photographs had not revealed an accident. They had revealed a decision. And Jason had known the entire time. What surprised me most was not the betrayal itself. It was how calm I felt after finally understanding it. Sometimes uncertainty causes more pain than truth. Once uncertainty disappears, clarity takes its place. Over the next week, several additional pieces fell into place. During a casual phone conversation, Jason accidentally mentioned expenses from the trip. The numbers caught my attention immediately. They were far higher than I expected. As I thought about it later, another realization surfaced. Over the previous year, I had contributed thousands of dollars toward various family needs. Home repairs, school expenses, vacation savings. None of it had seemed unusual at the time. Yet now I could not ignore the possibility that some of that support had indirectly helped fund the very trip from which I had been excluded. The irony would have been almost amusing if it had not been so revealing. One evening I opened the family photo album again and turned slowly through its pages. This time I was not looking for memories. I was looking for truth. By the time I closed the album, I understood something important. The problem was no longer whether my family had wronged me. The problem was whether they believed they would ever be held accountable for it. And for the first time, I began considering what would happen when they finally discovered that I knew everything. The first week of February arrived with gray skies and steady rain. By then, I had already met with Daniel twice. Every document had been reviewed. Every question had been answered. The uncertainty that once clouded everything was gone. All that remained was a decision. One Tuesday morning, I called Jason and invited him, Lauren, and Emma to dinner the following Sunday. His surprise was obvious. For weeks I had kept my distance. Suddenly, I was hosting a family gathering. He accepted immediately. Lauren sounded equally enthusiastic when she called later that afternoon to ask if she could bring dessert. I told her that would be lovely. The entire week passed quietly. I spent my time organizing papers, preparing meals, and rereading one particular letter Robert had left behind. The more I read it, the more I understood why he had trusted me with the responsibility he had placed in my hands. Sunday arrived cold and clear. By 5 o'clock, the dining room table was set. Unlike Christmas Eve, there were no extra expectations attached to the evening. The turkey roasted in the oven. The candles flickered softly. Outside, the last traces of winter sunlight faded behind the trees. At 6 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Jason and Lauren entered carrying smiles and a pie. Emma followed behind them, chatting excitedly about school. For the first hour, everything felt surprisingly normal. We ate dinner, shared stories, laughed about old family memories. Anyone looking through the window would have seen a perfectly ordinary family gathering. But beneath the surface, I sensed tension. Jason kept glancing toward me as if waiting for something. Lauren seemed unusually attentive. They knew I had changed. They simply did not know why. After dessert, I asked everyone to join me in the living room. I retrieved a folder from the side table and placed it on my lap. The room grew quiet. Emma settled into a chair beside the fireplace. Jason leaned forward slightly. Lauren folded her hands together. I began by reading Robert's letter aloud. His words filled the room with a calm authority that seemed to reach across the years. He spoke about integrity, responsibility, family, trust. No one interrupted. When I finished, silence lingered for several seconds. Then I opened the folder and explained the trust he had established years earlier. I carefully outlined the responsibilities attached to it and the decisions that rested solely with me. Lauren's expression changed almost immediately. Jason looked confused at first, then increasingly concerned as the details became clear. For years, they had assumed certain things about the future. Assumed access. Assumed outcomes. Assumed certainty. Now they were learning that nothing had ever been guaranteed. I was not angry. I did not raise my voice. I simply presented the facts. The power of the moment came from its simplicity. Nobody could argue with documents. Nobody could argue with Robert's own words. As the evening drew to a close, I noticed something I had not seen in a very long time. For the first time in years, my family was truly listening to me. And as they quietly processed everything they had learned, I realized the most important conversation of all had not happened yet. The conversation I had expected finally arrived too. Days later, Jason called and asked if he could stop by alone. When he arrived that evening, he looked older than he had just a few weeks earlier. We sat at the kitchen table where so many family discussions had taken place over the years. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then he looked down at his hands and said something I had not heard in a very long time. He apologized. Not with excuses. Not with explanations. An actual apology. He admitted that the Christmas trip had been planned months in advance. He admitted that there had been conversations about whether to invite me. He admitted that he had chosen the easier path instead of the right one. Listening to him was painful, but it was also strangely freeing. The truth was finally standing in the open. Over the months that followed, many things changed. Some changes happened quickly. Others took time. Lauren remained polite, but the confidence she once carried so easily seemed different now. For the first time, she understood that influence and entitlement were not the same thing. Emma continued visiting regularly, and our relationship grew stronger than ever. Without realizing it, she had become the person who brought honesty back into the family. As spring turned into summer and summer into autumn, I focused less on what had happened and more on what kind of future I wanted. I joined community events, reconnected with old friends, traveled more, filled my calendar with people who genuinely enjoyed my company, rather than simply benefiting from my generosity. Something remarkable happened during that time. The loneliness I feared never arrived. In its place came peace. By the following December, the house looked different. Fresh garlands decorated the staircase. A new tree stood beside the fireplace. Soft lights reflected across the windows. Yet the biggest difference could not be seen in the decorations. It could be felt in the atmosphere. There was no waiting, no anxiety, no desperate hope that others would choose me. The people gathered in my home that year were there because they wanted to be. Some were family. Some were friends. All of them brought something far more valuable than presents. They brought respect. Late that evening, after dinner had ended and laughter filled the living room, I paused beside the window and watched snow falling gently across the yard. The same yard I had stared at 1 year earlier while wondering why I was not enough for the people I loved. Now I understood the answer. Their choices had never defined my worth. They had only revealed their priorities. Across the room, Emma was helping clear the table while Jason carried dishes into the kitchen. There was still healing to do. Trust takes longer to rebuild than it takes to break. But for the first time in years, the effort was real. I glanced at Robert's photograph resting on the sideboard and smiled. The responsibility he left behind had never been about controlling the future. It had been about protecting what mattered. And in the end, what mattered most was not money, property, or legal documents. It was learning that family is not measured by who shares your name. Family is measured by who shows up when it matters. The empty chair that once stood at the center of my pain had become something else entirely. It had become the moment that finally taught me my value. And that's the end of today's story. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more unforgettable stories like this. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.